morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on the Blowback Roundtable. I say morning, but it's only morning for me. Ben is in Pécs, Hungary, and it's 6 p.m. Carlo is in DC, and it's, I think, 12 noon, right?
Right.
We have Alice and Serafina. I think they're both joining us from Philadelphia, but I could be mistaken.
They're nodding along.
Okay, great. And I think it's East Coast time, so it's 12 noon there. Alice and Serafina are both with the Saturday Free School, and they have graciously accepted our invitation to come on our program and discuss the Centennial of James Baldwin's birth. And myself, Ben, and Carlo have expressed a little bit of lack of knowledge regarding Baldwin and his life, and we were just hoping to kind of learn a little bit about who James Baldwin was and the remembrance and the celebration that the Saturday Free School is having this year, for the 100th year of his birth. So having said that, I would like to turn it over to Alice, if possible, and maybe she can tell us more about James Baldwin.
Yeah, good afternoon, and thank you for having us on the show. So James Arthur Baldwin, he is one of the fundamental pillars of the Saturday Free School for Philosophy and Black Liberation. I know he has become sort of a cultural phenomenon in the U.S. And I think largely it's been due to being a essayist, novelist, but I think specifically for we in the Free School, we also see him as a revolutionary through his writings, but also his participation in the period of the 60s and onwards in what's known as the Black freedom struggle. So I think, namely, we are celebrating him for those reasons. And I think through his work and through his life, he has worked towards transforming politically, morally, spiritually, the fabric of American society. So we're looking to celebrating his 100th birth anniversary in 2024.
And in addition to that, the basis of the year of Baldwin is in the light of what Alice was mentioning, the Black freedom movement, and in the literacy campaigns of that were conducted by SNCC, CORE, and SCLC. And the reason why that's important is because we are intending to go to the people with the year of Baldwin. We go to the people's institutions, like schools, the libraries, bookstores, that kind of thing. And the reason for Baldwin for our times is to give a certain language to allow, like what Alice was saying, the moral capacity of the American potential to be used and to have a vision for the future.
So I'm gonna vulgarize a little bit, and try and encapsulate, my understanding of where Baldwin was coming from. One of the main things, as I understand it, is that he was about unity amongst the working class, and he understood that there was obviously racial differences, but he definitely was not like a separatist, right? So he wanted the working class to unite and overcome their cultural, racial, religious differences. Is that an accurate vulgarism of?
Yeah, it's an interesting statement because a lot of what Baldwin would say actually is that we aspire as an American people to achieve the last white nation, to get rid of this thing of whiteness as a like kind of a to get rid of whiteness as a sense of morality, as a frame of what is the world view. Um, and that also means that white people have more of a potential to become complete human beings when they themselves are no longer white in essence. And the same thing goes with, because the essential criticism or the essential characteristic that Baldwin is pointing out is, why does America need a black man? And what then does that do to the American frame of thinking, worldview, and the sense of the future? And that also would be reconciled with the maturity that would have to, like, there's a sense of like the striving for maturity, um, with the coming to the idea that not only is the black man, but also stands for a different state of morality, um, of another, of a new world, kind of in that sense. Um, because what's at risk is the lie of whiteness, or what the idea of, the Lily, house with the family, what the idea of being able to achieve power while lying about one's own history and what actually happened to achieve that state of power, whether that be the killing of the Native Americans or the slave trade, or that kind of idea. So when we're talking about Baldwin and achieving the last white nation, we're also talking about what's at stake for the transformation or the ability to become a new American people, based in Martin Luther King, um, either World House, the idea of the World House, or the vision of an America to achieve a certain state of real democracy for the people.
Okay. Can I kind of chime in as the East European here, as not knowing a lot of the definitions and the path? I mean, what the guy I'm familiar with, I love your sweater, is Du Bois, mostly his work, and of course Martin Luther King through the civil rights movement. But as coming, coming miles, thousands of kilometers away, like Lenin died the year Baldwin was born, and I sort of know his background. He came from highly educated parents, went all around the the capitals of Europe. Then the Tsar killed his brother, and he became like a fundamentally one-sided figure, trying to destroy the injustice, not just in his family, but in Russia, which became the Soviet Union through his hands. I'm wondering if you could give an intro on James Baldwin. He's born. He's a black man. What shaped him? Before we get to all the mission statements, who was he? How did he become what you know? You already arrived at the big message that he left to the world, and I don't really understand it without the context. I'm wondering if you could give me a bit of a, what do you call these? The 101, the boot, an introduction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually, your question is very much related to the response that Serafina had given, which is that Baldwin never forgot that he was a black man. So he had grown up in Harlem, and even though much of his 20s and I believe early 30s were spent in Europe, from his writings, from his thoughts, he was always looking at America and also his upbringing and and essentially what you're saying as from whence he came. So he was born
intellectual by his 20s, 30s, already an intellectual background.
Yeah, that's
okay. Thank you.
And not in the or I guess that question is also complicated in terms of what we mean by intellectual. I think in our present times, the way an intellectual often is depicted, characterized, it's removed from the people. But Baldwin himself, he was someone who was organic to Harlem, the Black community, and the way he describes it also is that, and specifically in one of his letters or writings titled "Letter to My Nephew," he describes of them coming from a sturdy peasant stock, and it is the enslaved ancestors that he's talking about, where not it wasn't many generations removed, where his mother, I believe, and Serafina, you can correct me too, came from the South, and his grandparents were enslaved. And the um, and I think that's the story that, or not the story, but that's the background that he comes from, where it is the story of the migration from the South to the North for industry, but also of people in Harlem and New York City and what it meant to be a Black person in not just the North, but also in America in the 1920s and onwards.
And in
Go ahead,
addition
Carlo.
to what you're saying, Alice, is what the importance of the Black church, because then that also, because what you said, what do you mean by intellectual? The being a preacher is also something that Baldwin would speak about in his being able to see his father preach, and the reason why his father preached is because he says that his father had to become a saint to become a man. And then when Baldwin was asked why he became a preacher, he said, in thinking back to it, or reminiscing in a way of whom he was as a 13-year-old, 14-year-old in the ghettos of Harlem, that he also had to reconcile how he can become a man in a similar way that his father had to reconcile that question. So then being an intellectual also has to do, or more or less has to deal with, how one thinks of themselves in society. Um,
So tell us, he's in his 20s. It's the 1940s. Go ahead, Carlo, if you have something.
I think one point we're missing here is we have to address his homosexuality too, because that in context would definitely shaped his life. Um, so can you speak to how his homosexuality affected his thinking?
what do you mean by how his homosexuality affected his thinking?
Well, I'm an old man, and when I was younger, black friends I had, males, as well as white males, primarily, homosexuality was aberrant, and and it was rejected vehemently by a number of black friends I had, who also were
Mm-hmm.
also very intelligent.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm just, and this isn't, and I'm talking about in the 60s. So
Mm-hmm.
even then, so have been a black homosexual man in in America during, and even in, well, Europe was much more accommodating. That's why so many jazz musicians went to Europe. But to be a black homosexual man in America had to have a large impact on your thinking. And I just thought maybe you could address.
Well, the only reason why I asked that is because the most crucial thing about Baldwin is that he's a Black man. And like there was a time even in his life before he went to France that he was wanting to get married and that he wanted kids. But he decided, since he had 8 children already, which were his siblings to take care of, and that he needed to take responsibility not for his kids but for all of us, really. um, he needed to write. But what also grounds his writing is when he comes back to America and he talks in the vein of King, or because of King. He talks to he talks to on a much broader scale. So that's what I mean. I was trying to just clarify.
No, and I think also I completely agree to Serafina where Baldwin mainly saw himself as a black man, because I think in our times there's a misconception, for example, that Giovanni's Room, one of his more famous novels, is about homosexual or gay love. But actually, the way he describes that novel is not about homosexual love, but actually about the question of what happens when a person is unable to love. And that's not just between whether it's two men or whatever, it's in a society that is incapable of love, what happens to individuals, the choices that they make, and the consequences that they also face. And so I think that's also something that we do address in the Year of Baldwin too, which is what is Baldwin's concept of love? It's not just sexual love, but actually the love that he's talking about when he talks about the history of Black people in this country and the future of Black people in this country. What does it mean to love, to be in community with one another? And I think that is the broader conception of love and Baldwinian love that we talk about in the Free School.
Okay, so again, Eastern Europe chiming in. In his 20s, 1940s, segregated America, being gay, double disenfranchised, I guess that would be Carlo's point. From that point of, extreme, at the end of, luck, I guess, fortune in life, he became this, what you describe as a people's writer. He had to write for all of us, for each of us. I think this is what Serafina said. What becomes later in his life? How does this describe the next 20, 30 years? Not just his thinking, but what was his life like? I really want to know.
Yeah, so Baldwin was born in 1924, and I guess it speaks to the fact that it's his 100th birth anniversary. I believe when he was 24, he had left for Paris, Europe. So that would have been like 40s, late 40s, early 50s.
Post-war. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And he traveled between the US and Europe, but it was in the early 60s that with King and with the Black freedom struggle, civil rights movement, the organization of, as Serafina mentioned earlier, the SCLC with the student protests in the South, that he felt a responsibility to come back to the United States. And that's where he's involved in the March on Washington, I think the Selma rides as well, and participate in various events, but also being a witness for these events as well, not just as a bystander, but also actively participating as he was also writing.
I had a question that just popped into my mind. What was Baldwin's relationship with MLK? Were they close? Did they mingle, or
fellow travelers?
You guys.
Yeah, what I was just going to mention is that maybe not very close friends, but Baldwin admired King a lot. He would say young Martin or whatever. And that would also mean that he felt that Martin was a part of him as a person. And there was few encounters. He writes about this also in The Dangerous Road Before Martin Luther King, that essay. But Alice is probably be more specific.
Okay.
I just wanted to say about a comment on James Baldwin and Malcolm X. I found both of them to be extraordinarily insightful, and what makes them intellectuals is that they are able to cut to the bone when it comes to a situation that calls for a kind of complex thinking, and they maintain a kind of rationality that that's extraordinary. I mean, Baldwin on the when he went well on the William F. Buckley show, he just cut Buckley to ribbons. It was only I think only comparable to Noam Chomsky's appearance, where Buckley said he wanted to punch Chomsky because Chomsky had just defeated him so thoroughly. And I think that that Baldwin's ability to address the injustices is extraordinary in a truly intellectual sense, and I mean in an enduring sense, which I'm sure that's why you have picked up picked up on him, because of that ability to just cut right through all the crap and get right down to what's going on, and doing it in a way that sort of ends the argument. Uh, I'm kind of an extraordinary, and he was an extraordinary intellect to my mind. So anyway,
He was a youth pastor before he went to Europe, right? He was a youth pastor for a few years. And obviously, Martin Luther King was a pastor as well.
Just trying to put together his life, his income, what he ate, So he was a writer in Europe, right? Not a musician, yes, or a chimney sweep or something. And then he became part of, like, I'd call it an agitator, part of the movement, the civil struggle in the US. And then I guess we go on. What else did he do? I'm just trying to get a picture of the guy,
Well, it's so funny because it is true that as much as Baldwin loved King, he loved Malcolm too. And there's something about Baldwin that is able to understand is a simple word to say what we were saying about, like, the love ethic or whatever, like that. Him as a person, he could see also Malcolm, Martin as people, in the sense of their taking up of an enormous responsibility and task. So it does make me emotional in a certain sense that, Carlo, you are saying that Baldwin is an extraordinary man, because he is, and he is also deserving of attention that can be used for people who might not have discovered in the same sense what he means. But that is what I would also say to whom he is as a man, as a thinker, is that he loved the immortal child and he was dedicated to it. As
what's
far
that?
as his
What's the immortal child?
Like, as you said, when you say that you mentioned Du Bois, immortal child is a concept that we also talk about from his essay called The Immortal Child.
I see, sorry.
About Coleridge Taylor, a musician whom Du Bois uses as a metaphor to discuss the responsibility, or essentially the responsibility in the sense of Baldwin, the poet. And what that also, so I'm using that to say, for what do we do politics, or for what do we study James Baldwin as God's revolutionary voice for our time? It is also for a new world coming to being, and that's, the mission, right? That's for, like, the specifics of his life. He was moving in the civil rights movement, and as, like, for example, he had a famous meeting with Kennedy alongside Lorraine Hansberry and other civil rights leaders, and he was teaching and speaking on a variety of topics, whether that be the moral responsibility of the artist, the America Free of the Brave. Like, there's a variety of speeches on YouTube that can be accessed and listened to. And alongside that, he was writing his novels. The first one being the first one before Another Country, because I'm reading Another Country right now. But Go Tell It on the Mountain, which he took 10 years to complete. And at the he was able to finish it by listening to Bessie Smith in somewhere in Switzerland, was it? I think, Alice, it was Switzerland, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where his friend had took him because his friend knew that Baldwin was going through like this kind of, he was getting ill, as Baldwin was saying, I was ill, and he needed to be taken to the Switzerland, white on white town, who never saw a black man before. And so that's how he finished Go Tell It on the Mountain, which is almost a reconciliation with himself and his family and his father. And with Another Country, it deals with the possibilities of a new American people. He finishes that book in 1963. What's important also is that even if he had taken a specific amount of time, whether that be 10 years or like he took a chunk of time on these novels and essays. And so that also speaks to the poignancy, like you're saying, Carlo, the special and weighty thing that Baldwin was capable of doing and had done. So him coming to the civil rights movement, him writing, and him thinking about what we were talking about as the immortal child, meaning what this America has the potential to be, was all the things that encompasses James Baldwin. And that as an idea never dies either. So that's also what we're using for the year.
And you mentioned Coleridge Taylor early on, right? And that would show that Baldwin had a familiarity with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the English Romantic poet who wrote Kubla Khan and Frost at Midnight. And he was just a giant. And so that's another aspect of Baldwin, is that he was just an intellectual in the sense he was widely read and was able to use all of these tools to bring to his insights. And the word you used was thinker. That's what Baldwin was. He was a thinker, a profound thinker. Uh,
Yeah, it's
what I
really,
know about Baldwin, I'm just so
yeah.
impressed. Go ahead.
Well, from what you're saying, also reminds me of the conversation that Baldwin had with Nikki Giovanni, who was also a younger writer of her time amongst the Black arts movement that were coming up in the '60s, which is a later period than like the Harlem Renaissance or whatever like that. And within the conversation, it is an interesting back and forth about Baldwin and what he was writing and how that affects Nikki Giovanni. Nikki Giovanni also representing a generation that is trying to figure out what to use and how to move forward from King and Baldwin or whatever. And so I was just thinking, as you're saying, that his students and the people who've read Baldwin, who are also living while Baldwin was living, also creates an interesting point to follow up on for further discovery. But Nikki Giovanni is the best conversation to see. What questions was Nikki thinking about and why, and then how much Baldwin, as in this point of his life, older than Nikki, seen as like an older, like kind of brother or father figure or a close friend, mentoring and trying to think through or get to Nikki Giovanni in a way. So yeah, there was a lot of conversation about Baldwin when he was alive, and we want to keep that alive.
Mm-hmm.
So the Saturday Free School has inaugurated this year as the Year of Baldwin. What are some of the activities and things that you guys have planned for this year?
This
And
is
actually, sorry, go ahead.
no, I'm just getting excited because this is the fun part. But Alice, you can say because I'll just keep going.
No, I think I was actually going to go back to a question that was asked earlier around the relationship between Baldwin and King. And it is a tremendously deep relationship in that both knew the history of Black people in this country and also the what Baldwin describes as the blues, the uses of the blues in one of his essays, where in this country there have been a people who have been the most brutalized, but also, in spite of it, become stayed optimistic or struggled for a different kind of future. And I think in the essay that Serafina had mentioned earlier, which is The Dangerous Road Before Martin Luther King Jr., he writes this in describing King and the kind of leader and person that King was, and the vision that King had for the future. And so what they shared was their vision for the future, which is one in which they saw that as much as, or Black people in this country, they're 10% or approximately, I think, 10%, 15% of the country. And the history of this country has been so tied to has been tied between Black and white. And what does that mean for a people? And what does it mean for it in terms of the values? And for both of them, they saw that the future for both were tied, which is that the future of African Americans in this country was the future of America. And if there was going to be a place where the Harlem that Baldwin describes, he grew up in Harlem, where it was an area that there was much poverty, and those who were much poverty and also being connected also to the wars that America was waging abroad. And I think that's the piece that both King and Baldwin also shared, which is not only their love for the American people, but also of the anti-colonial movements abroad, speaking out against the wars in Vietnam, in Korea, and actually seeing that the American people were also part of a broader humanity, a humanity that was tied. And so I think that's the reason why that's also significant, is that as we enter the year of Baldwin, I think there are many reasons why they are relevant for our times. And I think we can speak to or elaborate upon it. But I think one is that in the Free School, our analysis of society today is that America itself, it's known to be the wealthiest, one of the wealthiest nations in the world, but there is such deep poverty, materially, spiritually, but also is engaged in many wars abroad, which both Baldwin and King would have been greatly opposed to. I think that's the relevance for today. And I know Serafina is getting excited to talk about what we're doing, but that's the context in which we invoke the memory and the words and what both Baldwin and King stood for.
Yeah, that's good that you brought it back up, honestly, because I think there are a lot of people who write on King or maybe over intellectualize King. But one of the best ways to see King is to read Baldwin, because the way that Baldwin was affected, like that relationship is important for our time to understand King, and vice versa. There was two things. There's a speech that Baldwin said in introducing King at like a SNCC meeting. But the one I wanted to mention in the essay, The Dangerous Road, was when Baldwin was talking about preachers and specifically getting at why King was so special and important. And in the church, the preacher is not solely in a position to comfort his audience or to give out alms or whatever, in that sense of like trying to make complete amends. But the preacher is also the preacher as an idea was ultimately changed with King. And what happened was is that Baldwin was able to describe the effect that King had on his audience, the congregation, but affected the people. Because when King speaks, people, as Baldwin is trying to describe, is held to a certain responsibility to complete a certain task. But that's also because they hold King to it too. And that provides a special relationship, meaning that there was something that King was able to see in the South or in the congregation, and that people can consider like I am capable. But
I was reading the I don't think it was an essay or an article. It was a long it was the vision statement, Serafina. Is that what it was? You explained it earlier before the show. And one part of it stuck out for me. I was thinking maybe we could discuss it before. We're having a hard time getting to discussing the activities and celebrations that you guys have planned, which I do want to get to. But so this particular part, I really like this sentence or two from the vision statement. Talking about Baldwin, it said he avoided what he saw as farcical reinventions of worlds that only existed in the minds of their inventors, seeing them as ways to avoid the crisis of the modern world. So that's a very poignant statement, and it really, encapsulates kind of what is going on today, with the establishment press and liberalism in general, just proliferating out a certain understanding of things that is entirely detached from objective reality. And so, part of our job as revolutionaries is to help others to see the reality of things and to overcome these constructed narratives that are, only exist in the minds of, the people who invent them. So can somebody tie that in with Baldwin, or is that asking a lot?
No, not at all. I mean, I think, well, one, Baldwin is, if you see some of his interviews, he's extremely, I don't know what the word actually is to describe him, but he's a lot of fun, and that's a crude way of describing it, but in the ways that he makes you think a lot. And I say fun, and that is a trivialization, but what I actually mean is that when you listen to Baldwin talk and speak, actually, when you examine the words that he says, he makes you think a lot about what is reality and the world around you. And for example, when he says, I am not the N-word, and if you invented him, then there's a reason why it was for you, because that is not who I am. And the reason why I say that is because I think the way he talks about the American psyche and what Americans believe about themselves is also how they conduct themselves on the world scale. So, there is the sense in popular media that America is a democracy, and in our history and in today, our task has been to spread democracy to other countries. But similar to what he had said before is also Baldwin says in many of his speeches, to say that Cuba is communist does not say anything about Cuba. But there is a reason why there's a narrative of other countries and a narrative of what America is. And actually, to assess our relationship with other countries, we have to assess and analyze the assumptions that we have about ourselves. Why is it that we have to believe that we are the ones that are democratic and are civilizing other nations? And I think that I forget if that's the exact context in which the sentence that you had taken came from, but I think at least based on what I remember and understanding of Baldwin, that's what he's saying, which is the narratives that we invent about ourselves, about the world, say something about ourselves. And actually, if we're to change or to transform society, we must challenge those and transform those assumptions that we have about ourselves in relationship to one another, but also in relationship to the world. And I know you mentioned earlier that we'll probably get to some current events, but I do want to cover what the free school we are doing for the year of Baldwin and why we're doing it. So, as we might have mentioned before, it's going to be a year of Baldwin. So for the past 10 years, the Saturday Free School has organized, or one, we meet every Saturday and we discuss history, philosophy, current events, but really rooted in the city of Philadelphia, assessing the city around us and then also the world. But in addition to that, we have events that we've held, various symposiums. I know last time when Dr. Anthony Montero had joined, he had spoken about the Winston Symposium. But most oftentimes we believe that it is through a moral, political, spiritual education that we're able to transform the society. But in addition to those symposiums we've had, I think this is going to be the third year of, meaning in the past, in the decade of the free school, we've had the year of Gandhi, the year of Du Bois, and now we're having the year of James Baldwin. And in the year, a pillar of this year and previous year of has been the reading groups that Serafina has described at various institutions of the city. What that means is that every week or every other week we'll be at specific locations throughout the city. And so this includes, Serafina mentioned high schools, churches, mosques, bookstores, libraries, in which we'll be reading. It might not necessarily be the same essay or novel of Baldwin's, but we'll be reading Baldwin throughout the entire year together. And that's part of what we believe about the power of ideas, which is that how incredible would it be and how transformative would it be for the city of Philadelphia for groups of individuals to be reading together at the same time a specific figure, and a figure that we've spoken to in terms of why he's important. Because the idea is, how different would a society be if they were raised on Baldwin, if they were raised on King, if they were raised on these figures that we believe spoke to the future of America. So that's going to be one of the pillars of the year of Baldwin. Then we'll also have these symposiums throughout the year, and actually the first is going to be on February 17th. It's a Saturday, next Saturday, where we'll launch the year of Baldwin. So typically at these symposiums, we've had the vision statement, reading the vision statement, why we see Baldwin's important, his ideas, but also having a documentary that members of the free school are putting together to show Baldwin and the kind of person he was, his ideas, and then go into a panel. And I forgot to say, but it's James Baldwin, or the year of James Arthur Baldwin, God's Revolutionary Voice. And we're dedicating it actually to the immortal children of Gaza. And specifically because whenever we study these events in history, or these figures, these events, we also see its relevance to today. And the issue of our time is what's happening in Gaza and the struggle of the Palestinians too. And so the launch itself will be one of the symposiums that we have throughout the year, but we'll continue to have events. The next one being on April 4th, that's going to be in celebration, and it's the anniversary of King's a speech, A Time to Break Silence, which is his speech coming out against the Vietnam War. But that will also be a symposium. We'll have the similar components where we'll have speakers, panels, but also cultural performances that we've always tried to bring into our works because of that worldview that King and Baldwin have, and the role of art that we see as well, a revolutionary art, art that represents actually the cultures, the civilizations of people. And that's the second pillar where we'll have these events. And then lastly, we'll also have a podcast for the Year of Baldwin for those who aren't able to join a reading group in person, because those reading groups throughout the city will be in person throughout the city of Philadelphia. But the podcast will serve as a way in which we read together, bring on guests as well to speak about Baldwin in more detail throughout the year. Serafina, did I miss anything?
Okay.
She wa-
We're gonna put some links to where all this information and all the currently scheduled activities are going to be. So is that just going to be at the Sacramento at the
Philadelphia.
Saturday Free School? Is that where all the information about the different the upcoming symposiums and events can be at the Saturday Free School website?
Yes, so we have a website for the Free School, and there should be a link actually directly to a page for the Year of Baldwin. So actually, it's yearofjamesbaldwin.org.
Okay.
And so you'll find the vision statement, the events, different reading sites, so on.
Awesome.
And so forth. Mm-hmm.
I'll put both of those links in the comment section. I was gonna try and ask about, if what specifically, can we maybe describe Baldwin's vision of the future and kind of what gave him optimism? Because he was optimistic. I think it's a well-founded optimism, but sometimes looking around at how things are, it's easy to maybe lose your optimism. Where did Baldwin's optimism come from, and what made him optimistic? That's another tough question.
It is, but before you,
because,
okay, go ahead.
Sorry. No.
No, I was just going to add that I know you're not like a political party with a program, but you've talked about transformation of society through reading, through cultural, artistic. I really want to know, like, sell it to me. What is the future society in America that you're trying to get to? I'd really love to, based on your readings.
Well, in the Nikki Giovanni conversation, Baldwin was like, what makes me optimistic is when I look at you, Nikki Giovanni, or when I hold a baby. And the other thing was at the end of that conversation where they were speaking about, I forget how they got to it, but then Baldwin was like, well, it is about love. And then Nikki is like, and love is a big responsibility. But then Baldwin was like, it's the only responsibility to have. And so to your question specifically about Baldwin and how he is a visionary and maintain that vision is through what we are speaking to his idea, or in general, the idea of love as a transformative force, as a moral basis to a world framework.
Just love? Sorry. Love will transform society?
It's in the sense, I think it is love in the sense of science, which is something that the Free School has been endeavoring in while we study in the question of like physics and things like that. But it's a scientific question. How is nonviolence a answer to desegregation? And how would that specifically affect the way an individual behaves in accordance to another, which makes me think of Diane Nash's Diane Nash, who was a part of Snake, I believe, which I might be getting wrong, but she would say, or she had said I think in the King in the Wilderness interview that, well, now both sitting at the lunch counters or in her experience in different desegregation actions, that the world has to change around you and a new standard. So that's also what I mean.
I think actually, I mean, even the question is, if not love, what is going to change the society? And the reason why is because, or the reason why I asked this question is that what we see today is the result of a loveless society, of people who grow up in the society not feeling like they're loved and will amount to anything or will accomplish anything in this life. And actually within the free school, that is what we see as what has, or actually what we believe is that with the transformation of individuals, and individuals are transformed by love, that a society is actually able to change. Because what we saw during what we have called the Third American Revolution in the Civil Rights Movement is that Black people, and also, I mean, and white allies too, who saw that they had children that they were responsible to and they wanted to build a different society for, that is why they made certain sacrifices, and that is why they stood up. And and you see the impacts of what had happened in the civil rights movement. And in the United States, that is the occurrence of when actually a people who believe themselves and believe in their future and believe in their children actually stood for something and made a contribution that moved America forward. And I think love is also what makes people optimistic, because actually many children who grow up in America are extremely pessimistic about the world, pessimistic about, in Philadelphia, you walk around and you're always seeing poverty. And how do you, like, there's poverty, it's dirty, but there's something about Philadelphia that keeps it going. And it is the love of the people and the strivings of the people. And, Baldwin speaks to this too in all of his essays, but, there's this one specific essay that he writes, and it's called The Uses of the Blues. A group of us in the free school had just read it together. And he's saying that, one of the delusions, actually back to what Billy, you were saying earlier, is that, one of the delusions that white American society has is that you can have a life that is without pain, and you can, the aspiration is that you make enough money, you move to the suburbs, you never have to see Black people, you never have to see poverty, but that
you escape. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, you escape. But, but part of life and part of the beauty of life actually is knowing that there will be death and there will be pain. And in spite of that, you are able to make it through because of the people and because of other people. And that's actually what's beautiful about this life too. It's not just trees and it's not just plants, but actually other human beings. And I think that's what, Baldwin and King and Du Bois are constantly talking about, which is that it's love that holds any society together. A loveless society just dies. And, what happens when you don't suffer and you don't struggle and you don't strive? And I think that is, or at least that is what we're trying to share with a society that has become very pessimistic because of what has happened, or because of its history, because of a ruling elite that we talk about, propaganda too, that speaks of just endless wars. And like, that is what we're trying to instill, a certain love and hope and a responsibility. Baldwin says, if it's not being picked up, it's because you're not picking it up. And that's also what King, and Baldwin says this in the way he describes King too, which is that King was one of the first leaders who told Black people what he was telling white people, which is that, when Mr. I forget what name he uses, but Mr. X, one of his many Black people worked in the houses of white people. When Mr. Charlie asked you, what do you think about slavery, or not, what do you think about slavery? What do you think about segregation? So on and so forth. King says, like, I want you to tell them, I disagree with it. And I hope, Mr. Charlie, you would do something about it tomorrow morning. And it is the sort of, or it is the joy of life and the constant, or the struggle and the belief that in people that is going to change the society. And that's also the democracy that we talk about, where people themselves feel empowered, or people themselves feel that they can make a change.
A grassroots transformation, away from the kind of selfish individualism that's definitely inculcated, by the status quo. And we got to move past that, because that isn't offering anybody anything. A lot of people have, emptiness and are not satisfied with, what the society offers. So love is the missing ingredient. That's absolutely true. You guys have been really great. We've been going for nearly an hour. I know Serafina had to get to class, at some point.
I hope she didn't. She might have skipped that class. I'm not sure.
She's prioritizing us, and we really appreciate that. Do we want to try and get to current events? Where's the panel at?
I wouldn't mind to take a pause and we could have a conversation about that at another time.
Okay.
Okay.
No problem. We're gonna, I'm sure we'll have you guys back, or somebody from the Saturday Free School, as your guys' events are upcoming. I heard you had one in April, so we'd definitely like to have you back to talk about that symposium in April. I know there's some things going on also this February, this month. So all those links will be in the comments. Anything else, guys?
April 4th is also the liberation of Hungary. It used to be for 40 years, so a good celebratory date.
Nothing for me, but
thank you.
I said, but thank you for having us on.
Oh, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks
Our
very much.
pleasure. Our pleasure. We're gonna be back tomorrow, I'm pretty sure, and we'll talk more about current events tomorrow. Ben, Carlo, and I. Thank you, Alice. Thank you, Serafina. I hope to have you back at some point very soon. So with that, we will see everyone tomorrow. Thanks again.
Take care.